That story in the book of Genesis about sin and the fall of Adam and Eve is a very complex and beautiful story. It's a way of trying to explain why there is evil in the world and trying to explain why there is conflict in our relationships, especially in our families, our communities, our church, our country. Jesus once said that I haven't come to bring peace, but I've come to bring division, to expose the conflicts that we have with each other. And you'll notice, first of all, God notices that Adam and Eve are hiding. And he says, well, why are you hiding? And they don't really own what had happened. As a matter of fact, they start blaming each other, which is always our temptation, of course. Instead of owning and taking responsibility for something, we can always find an excuse. You know, the devil made me do it. Well, first of all, God approaches Adam and says, Adam, why did you do this? And he says, well, that woman, the one that you gave me. So Adam is not only blaming Eve, but blaming God for the whole thing. And of course, that's easy enough to do. We can always blame God for everything because God started this whole thing. And then God approaches Eve and says, Eve, why did you do this? And she said, well, you know, that serpent tricked me into it. Now, we can be tricked. We can have temptations and give in to them, but we can't absolve ourselves from total responsibility. There's a saying that the devil made the pot, but not the lid. The devil made the pot, but we put the lid on it. And so we can't excuse ourselves totally from things that go wrong. And then, of course, God says, well, I'm going to put enmity between all of you. Now, we can be mistaken and think that God is the one who punishes sin and punishes us. But God doesn't punish us. The consequences of our sin and our choices is what punishes us. We can't blame God. It's because of our own doing. We do this to ourselves. Now, in the gospel, it helps us understand how it is that Jesus also experienced conflict in his family. Mark's gospel is the only one that says his relatives thought that he was crazy, that he was out of his mind. And they even try to do an intervention. They come to his home where he is with his disciples and where he's teaching. And they try to persuade Jesus to go back home, to come back to Nazareth, and to forget this whole mission thing. And then the scribes from Jerusalem accuse Jesus of being possessed. I think Jesus had hoped to fit in to the religious circles of his day, but he didn't. He didn't fit in at all. And he was seen as kind of a self-appointed rabbi, kind of a freelancer rabbi, a street rabbi. And so his family were trying to intervene and persuade him to give this whole thing up. And that must have been very difficult. You know, when your own family is accusing you of something, that's much more hurtful than when others do that. And then at the very end of that gospel, again, his family shows up and they say, your mother, your father, your sisters, your brothers are out waiting for you. And Jesus said, these are my mother, my father, my sisters, my brothers. These are my relatives, those who do the will of God. That Jesus' family was far beyond his blood relatives. And I think that's true for us as well. And so we're called to reflect on our own families and our relationships. You know, sometimes in families, they hold grudges. We hold grudges for years. And we even forget why. You know, why don't you talk to your brother anymore? Well, I can't remember why. You know, the ideal is that we have union of mind and hearts. That's the ideal. But when we can't agree with each other, and we can't have a union of minds, we can still have a union of hearts. We can still choose to love those we disagree with. We have to learn how to disagree with each other. We need to learn how to have difficult conversations. And certainly that's true in our church. Jesus prayed that we all would be one. And that's what we hope for, that eventually we'll have one church, one community of disciples of Jesus. Now, I don't know whether you read recently that Pope Francis got a phone call from God on his cell phone. Well, first of all, Francis was very surprised that God even had a cell phone, and surprised that God even knew how to use it. So God called Francis and said, Francis, how are things? He says, well, pretty good. A few things I have to take care of. He said, well, Francis, you better sit down. I have some good news and some bad news for you. He said, okay, well, tell me the good news first. He said, well, the good news is I've decided to form one church so that we all think alike, we all believe alike, and we all worship alike. And Francis said, well, that's wonderful news. What could be bad news about that? He said, well, Francis, I'm calling from Salt Lake City. Now, I've probably told this before, so thank you for laughing. Now, I don't feel badly telling that joke because most of my family are Mormon, and so I have a lot of respect for them. But we do pray for a union of hearts and minds. And we do pray for a healing of relationships in our families. And again, we don't always have to agree with each other in order to love each other.